Hey, it's BG. You know, reconciliation with Indigenous people is something Canadians agree needs to happen and needs to happen now. Canadians are heading to the polls after a devastating year full of hard truths and confrontations with our country's violent and racist past. In May of 2021, there was the discovery of 215 unmarked graves at the site of a former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. And since then, the graves of more than 1,300 other children have been found. And unfortunately, this is just the beginning.
While to some of the nation, these discoveries have been shocking, to Indigenous communities, they have known about and advocated for support to uncover these sites for years. Elections are important as Indigenous communities have been promised for decades reconciliation and aid by the government, yet have not received enough. According to the 2021 Confederation of Tomorrow survey, 60% of Indigenous people believe that the governments have not gone far enough to advance reconciliation. The federal government announced this year they are distributing $27 million for First Nations to locate, identify, and commemorate Indigenous children buried in undocumented sites of former residential schools. But according to some studies, it is estimated that the total cost to excavate all former sites could be closer to $1 billion.
Indigenous people have experienced cultural genocide here in Canada, and it's actually the government's responsibility to reconcile and pay for the mistakes made. Reconciliation also means clean drinking water. Now, to their credit, the Liberal government has lifted 109 long-term boil water advisories since they came into power in 2015. However, there are actually 51 still in place right now. As reconciliation is a significant topic this election, let's look at what the parties are promising. Here are some of the highlights from their platforms.
Let's start with the Liberals. This is what they want to do. They want to build housing for Indigenous communities with $2 billion over 4 years. They want to provide more than $6 billion over 5 years to support infrastructure, maintenance, and construction in Indigenous communities, as well as continue First Nations community access to clean water and services with $125.2 million over 4 years. They want to invest in Indigenous early learning and childcare with $1.4 billion over 5 years, and they want to increase the hiring of nurses and other medical professionals in isolated First Nation communities at a cost of $354 million over 5 years. The Liberals are also promising to spend an additional $1.4 billion over 5 years for a mental health and wellness strategy to be developed with Indigenous communities. They want to take action to confront systemic racism against Indigenous people, especially in the justice system and healthcare. They want to launch an Indigenous urban, rural, and northern housing strategy and move forward on working with Indigenous partners to appoint a representative who will work with Indigenous communities, provincial, and territorial governments.
Okay, now let's look at the Conservatives, because they are planning to recognize safe drinking water as a fundamental human right and to end all long-term drinking water advisories on reserves. They also pledged to increase economic partnerships with First Nation communities and to provide $1 billion over 5 years to boost funding for Indigenous mental health and drug treatment programs. Plus, they want to develop a comprehensive plan to implement Truth and Reconciliation Committee calls to action 71 through 76. They also want to fund the investigation at all former residential schools in Canada where unmarked graves may exist, including the sites where children have already been discovered. Also, they want to develop a detailed and thorough set of resources to educate Canadians of all ages on the tragic history of residential schools here in Canada. The Conservatives also have committed to $25 million to national police support and community training programs to reduce the incarceration rates of Canada's Indigenous communities.
And now for the NDPs. They want to pledge to lift all drinking water advisories immediately. They also say they will close the health cap in Indigenous communities and develop a First Nations justice and policy strategy while advancing Indigenous rights and self-determination. The NDPs will also fully fund the search for grave sites at former residential schools. They will work with Indigenous communities to implement a co-developed and fully funded Indigenous national housing strategy within the first 100 days in office. They want to appoint a special prosecutor to pursue those who enacted harm in residential schools and require churches and governments to hand over all records that may assist in identifying children in unmarked graves or identifying those who were involved in their deaths. The NDPs also want to provide funds to communities to commemorate a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
Now, here's what the Green Party is promising. The Greens say they will end long-term boil water advisories by investing in and upgrading infrastructure and ensure every Indigenous person has access to educational opportunities. They also want to ramp up renewable energy development in First Nation communities and on Indigenous lands through partnerships with Indigenous People and United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Principles of Self-Determination. They also say they're going to ensure Indigenous people can access education based on their cultural and social priorities and get healthcare needs met without bureaucratic delays. They also say they want to create a for Indigenous by Indigenous housing support program for off-reserve Indigenous communities, including non-status Indigenous peoples. And lastly, the Green Party says they want to provide all Indigenous youth with access to post-secondary education. So listen, now you know what each party is promising regarding reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So hopefully this information will help inform how you cast your vote in Canada's election.